And we're live. Hello and welcome. My name is Sean Andrews, and I am your host. I'm the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association, and I'm broadcasting to you from the north side of Chicago.
And I'm Rob Carley. I'm your co-host, and I'm coming to you from Central Texas.
So thanks for joining us for this second episode of Breaking Culture Live. This program is an experiment that we hope will allow the opportunity for cultural studies scholars like those joining us today and activists to share their knowledge and reflect on current events as they happen, and provide a space for us all to gather and talk about what they mean and what we can do about it. The plan at the moment is that every Wednesday around lunchtime in Chicago or New York, and I guess brunch time, which is where Perry's on the West Coast is a sort of brunch time in California. We'll spend about half an hour breaking down the breaking news with cultural studies scholars and activists and discussing their work and how it helps us to understand a contemporary event or emergent trend. Today, we're joined by Perry B. Johnson and Courtney M. Cox. Johnson and Cox are the co-directors of The Sound of Victory, which is an interdisciplinary initiative dedicated to exploring the historic relationship between music, sound, and sport. They're also co-editors of a forthcoming NYU Press volume, also titled The Sound of Victory. And they're here to discuss the politics of the NFL halftime show in light of the controversy over the NFL's choice of the Puerto Rican performer Bad Bunny for the 2026 Super Bowl. Perry Johnson is a music scholar, culture historian, and producer. Her primary research and practice focus on issues of power and identity through a critical examination of America's culture and entertainment industries. In addition to her work on Sound of Victory, she is currently producing Arts Talk, which is the official podcast of the USC Arts Now initiative, and is also the associate producer and co-host of the second season of Outside the Lyrics, an award-winning Emmy-nominated documentary series from PBS. Johnson teaches at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Southern California. So she's joining us from there today. Welcome, Perry.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks. And Courtney M. Cox is an associate professor in the Department of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon. Her research examines issues related to identity, technology, and labor through sport and wine. Her book, Double Crossover, Gender, Media, and Politics in Global Basketball, considers how Black women and non-binary athletes maneuver through the global sports media complex. Uh, uh, Cox previously worked for ESPN, the Longhorn Network, NPR affiliate KPCC, and the WNBA's Los Angeles Sparks. So welcome, Courtney.
Thank you so much for having me, all.
Yeah, thanks for both of you for making time to chat with us today. I met a few weeks ago, and this just sort of demonstrates my like how not immersed I am in the controversies over the Super Bowl. When we first invited you, I thought this would certainly, it might have like blown over by the time we had this, but it appears that this controversy isn't going anywhere. As we all know, Turning Point USA, the organization founded by the late Charlie Kirk, has announced that it's going to hold an alternative Super Bowl halftime show, something that sounds logistically inadvisable, and which I hope we'll be able to discuss. And the weekend before last, Bad Bunny hosted Saturday Night Live, and though he didn't direct this controversy directly, he delivered part of his remarks in Spanish and let people know that they have 3 months to learn a bit of the language, the lessons for which could be helped by Duolingo's offer for a free 3 months of use of its app for customers who use the code Benito, which is Bad Bunny's birth name. And as Billboard reported yesterday, in the past few days, a petition has been launched to replace Bad Bunny with George Strait as a performer, which sounds like a sort of like a diversity hire, or what, I don't know what you would call him. When has he even been in the spotlight recently? So my first question, as scholars of music and sport, and especially at their intersection in the Super Bowl halftime, have you been surprised by how loud and sustained this controversy has been?
I mean, I don't think we could be super surprised by very much at this point, this very historical moment we find ourselves in. We wake up every day to the newness of it all. But I think one of the things that for Perry and I'll say, like, we are constantly sharing links to things. We are on Instagram, we're texting, we're constantly like, this isn't surprising, but look at this. And so I think part of it is so interesting as two folks that have sat together and watched all of the Super Bowl halftime shows, is that they are such interesting time capsules of who we are and where we are. And so it doesn't surprise me. This is kind of in my brain, the time capsule formation that's starting earlier and earlier. It's not just about this less than 15 minutes of time. It's about all the things that lead up. So even when we're writing and thinking through this, we're starting to pull our archival piece starts from the time we even launch, like who is going to perform. Our timeline starts there, thinking about the conversations, the discourses that really happen around the selection, and then the aftermath, like the actual conversation about the performances. So for me, I'll say not surprising, but it just continues to push our timeline up in terms of all the things we collect to kind of think about what this short concert between two halves of football really mean. It's become this much, much larger thing.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Not at all surprised. In fact, many of the sentiments that have been shared, backlash that has been as sort of elevated in this moment of controversy actually feels quite tired. And I say that as someone who sat with all of these halftime shows, sat for many years alongside Courtney, thinking about what this halftime show means, what it means to football, what it means to entertainment and culture industries, what it means to a conception of America, even as the NFL is trying to go global. And so there's always been these really interesting tensions and levels of hypocrisy that are present all at once. So not at all surprising. But I do think that the rollouts are different, and that, exactly to Courtney's point, it's like what exactly is being elevated in this moment tells us something about, like, where are we historically, culturally, politically, socially, and economically, actually, in this moment that makes particular things rise to the surface rather than others. But much of what has been said actually feels quite regurgitated from previous eras, previous controversies around belonging, around identity, around America, around patriotism. Not so much around football. It's about these sort of larger ideological conceptions of what this show should do, who it's for, and who should feel entitled to it or not to it.
I think we definitely want to talk a lot about these ideological conceptions and how they sort of fit into, especially the controversy. But just to take a step up, because you've kind of mentioned the global environment, one of the things you point to is the NFL Global Markets Program as part of your work. And I see that, between Spain, Mexico, and Argentina, a lot of these arrangements are with Spanish-speaking countries. And so I was curious, is that part of what might have influenced the choice of Bad Bunny? And maybe either way, I know that you look at the political economy of this program. So maybe if you could say something about how this halftime show is programmed, who chooses the artist, what kind of considerations seem to go into this?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is if you're watching an NFL game, if you are even watching anything else that's on a network that has the broadcast rights to the NFL, you're getting these commercials that are like, wake up super early, we're going to Dublin, we're going to all these places, right? So these places that have no historical relationship to American football. We also see the growth of camps that in many ways mimic what Major League Baseball has done in the past in terms of establishing camps, for example, in African countries, in the Caribbean. And so thinking about the ways that the expansion in terms of both the labor potential, right, of the future of the NFL is baked into that. And then the fandom, the expansion of fandom. Have we saturated the US market? Now we must move overseas. So I think there is something interesting about how international the NFL wants to be as this very American thing. So it feels like a very McDonald's exporting of culture in a particular kind of way. But then to think about what it means when we're also hearing from politicians that are saying the Super Bowl is for Americans to purchase tickets and attend. We will have ICE there. Don't come, right? So it's like, do you want it to be this international thing that has this larger mega sport kind of vibe that the World Cup, for example, has, which we can also talk about that in the States? right? Or the Olympics, also something we have to think about. What does it mean that there's both a desire for the international market and yet this very specific all-Americanization that's happening? So I can't speak specifically to what it means for Apple Music, the title sponsor of the halftime show, or for Roc Nation, who produces the show in tandem with the NFL. I'm not in those rooms, so I can only kind of think about those conversations. But when Perry and I are kind of thinking about who's the next performer, they have to have a big appeal, right? We can't have these niche artists. There's amazing artists that have incredible streaming numbers that are doing these things, but if they're kind of located within a very specific Gen Z or millennial market, the NFL, the folks that make decisions, typically don't embody those demographics. And so who makes the decisions? Who's seen as a big enough impact, the big enough numbers to draw the thing? What style of music? So we talk about genre a lot in terms of who has the types of maybe pop hits that can be kind of brought in. And so it becomes a thing where it kind of whittles us down to very few folks, right? So this international appeal makes sense in so many different ways. Obviously, we've seen Roger Goodell and others talk about how Taylor Swift has an open invite to do the halftime show, which is something we have not heard other artists have. But when you think about a Taylor Swift, a Beyonce, a Bad Bunny, it has to be these folks that have the numbers and a global appeal. I think we talked about previously how we were surprised. It would be great if Bad Bunny got it. We talked about this, but we're not sure if this political moment would allow Roc Nation to even push that name forward. So even seeing Bad Bunny come up, even though there is this global appeal that makes sense in terms of political economy, the politic of it was something that we weren't sure. We're like, Taylor Swift is the safest, easiest choice. The Chiefs go to the Super Bowl. We already know how they can market and frame a certain kind of like white heterosexual relationship as this ideal, right?
Yeah, I think, Courtney and I do these interesting exercises leading up to the announcements every year of sort of like, who are our predictions? And generally, we haven't entirely missed the mark in terms of the folks that are selected are generally in our short list. But there's always a little bit of hesitation because you don't know. And there's many sort of power brokers who have vested interests in terms of who shows up on these stages. But Bad Bunny's announcement, again, not entirely surprising, but it was one where we weren't sure if it would happen, precisely because what has happened in the wake of that announcement is precisely what we would have anticipated to happen in the wake of that announcement. At the same time, though, I think one of the terms that I've seen sort of thrown around in the wake of the announcement is that this was sort of a brave move by Roc Nation or the NFL, Apple Music. And to me, it's not. It's not, because they all know, those power brokers know also that this is some of the they understand this conjuncture in a particular kind of way. The culture wars that are being elevated on the daily, more and more in different forms of extreme. And so that is something that can be anticipated and predicted where other things cannot. It's like you don't quite know that there's going to be this alternative turning point show, right? But you can anticipate that the backlash that would then lead to that would be a part of the conversation. But why this term brave, I'm like, not really, because the numbers are there. Because if we're looking at it just from a political economic standpoint, it's like Bad Bunny was the most streamed artist for 3 years running on Spotify, right? Latin music as a genre is like governing the way forward of popular music. And he's the biggest Latin music artist, if not one of the biggest music artists worldwide. And also the controversy that the decision to enlist him generates is great for viewership. Right. Controversy leads to viewership automatic. It's like why we tune into reality TV or these debriefs, right? It's because the drama that gets churned up in those moments makes people tune in that maybe wouldn't have otherwise be tuned in, or people who are already going to tune in now have like a different kind of vested interest in it. So to me, it's not brave because it makes sense statistically, economically. Also, and that's just sort of Bad Bunny and his own stats, which are, he is an icon and, it's the most streamed artist. That means he's surpassing people like Taylor Swift, right? That means he's surpassing people like Beyonce, like the most in the world. But the other side of that, and actually I just saw on my way to campus this morning for the North American Sociology of Sport, one of their listservs dropped that there's a new report out from McKinsey that's looking at the growth of Latin viewers in terms of global sport. And I think the quote, which I have here in front of me, it says, this is McKinsey's analysis. It says the analysis shows that the US sports economy could nearly double to more than $300 billion by 2035, and Latino fans could represent 1/3 of that growth. So both from the music standpoint, from the sports standpoint, that intersection, it's perfectly poised for Bad Bunny to be that moment, because he is of that moment. And he's of that moment in the way that he has stood up as a personality, as an advocate, as an activist, speaking against some of the things that have been happening culturally and politically, which of course are part of a much larger history and relationship between the US and Puerto Rico. So not surprised. I'll just stop there.
So that's actually that's an extraordinarily concrete read of the conjuncture and the sort of like, why Bad Bunny, right? Like, this is fantastic. One of the things I was thinking about when I began looking over the work that you'd done, right? And also I was thinking about it in terms of Sean's leadoff question, right? Like the length of the controversy around the Bad Bunny performance, that it's still around, right? So one of the things that's interesting about this to me is that when thinking about these, the sort of, pick for the halftime show, Courtney, in one of the discussions you did, you referred to this as the limits of the appropriate, right? So you give this like excellent definition of this idea in your discussion of Kendrick Lamar's performance, the Georgia Tech discussion, where you say that the sort of scope and boundaries of appropriateness are the discursive logics and the ideological constraints that define who and what is permissible in a given conjuncture, right? So with this definition, we actually get an approach. And so Sean asks, have you been surprised by this, how sustained the controversy is? Part of this, when I looked at the concept of the limits of the appropriate, but like a methodologically guided concept, I'm wondering if this is because in this conjuncture, those ideological constraints are reflected in discursive logics that are like really forceful and narrowed, right? There's a concreteness to it, right? Like ice outside the stadium, right? Like that just we don't have that. Like, so when we're looking for something that identifies aspects of a conjunctural shift, this would be one of those things. So I'm thinking about this idea too, that when we're thinking about this as an American show and those limits of the appropriateness, but we're also talking about it in terms of ideology, ideology has this sort of universalizing mechanism of like, yes, we have this controversial thing, but we're bringing people in, and we're also not in that moment, right? There's not this notion of like, it's okay, nuance is necessary, particulars are fine, right? We can assert George Strait over Bad Bunny, even though it's 1 million to like, I don't even know, but so like, it's like clearly Bad Bunny's a more popular choice. So I think we have these like competing particulars and discursive logics that are drawing really hard lines in new ways between who counts and who doesn't as American, but directly in or upon the American social landscape in ways that we haven't seen in a while. It has existed, it's not unprecedented, but we haven't seen it in a while. So anyway, to like kind of get down to a question, when you describe the halftime show as a highly visible battleground, where American injustices and cultural ideologies are necessarily performed, negotiated, and contested, it seems like negotiation is off the table now. It's performed and contested in this conjuncture, or maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of like the way that I'm thinking about it. So I'm wondering if, given the importance of the show, and what you were both speaking about, controversy is the thing. That is what draws people in for whatever the motivations are. The halftime show anticipates more directly, I think, a battleground, more now than maybe before, right? So if this conjuncture amplifies what you've identified as the importance of the halftime show, because it can only be right now a kind of line in the sand, a performance of contestation, not one of nuance, and not one where there's a negotiation? Or is there room for cultural negotiation in this halftime show? And if so, what would that look like? Is this more of a battleground? Is there possibility for there to be some sort of cultural expression that leads to a synthesis and negotiation? I'm just wondering what you both think about that.
So the question of negotiation is maybe where I'll jump in, because I think it's a super, super interesting one. When I think about, if we just go with our very most recent memory of Kendrick Lamar's performance in the most recent halftime show, Again, lots of feedback on all sides around that. It either is the most revolutionary thing people have ever seen, or it disrespected America on all fronts, right? And so there's this encoding, decoding aspect that's fascinating to me. It's both about what did the artist mean? What's going on with the sets? What's going on with the camera work? And then how are people reading these performances? We're equally interested in both the production of these shows and the reception of them. And so when I think about the limits of the appropriate, there's a certain kind of representation and resistive potential that's happening with Kendrick Lamar and Samuel L. Jackson as a different kind of Uncle Sam, right? There's these kinds of ways of pushing back of what Black performers can and can't do. So they're talking about the limits of the appropriate in one way. And then on the other side, we have one of the background dancers who reveals a joint Palestinian Sudanese flag, which was not allegedly part of the production, and he's tackled as if he's a streaker, right, during a game. That tells us what the limits of the appropriate. You can perform this that has this resistive potential. You can perform not like us, right? That's the moment for a lot of people. But yet this kind of solidarity connection, connecting these struggles together, that's the limit. We can't have these solidarities happen. And so I think that we often learn either through the reception or in this way, NFL security, stadium security, getting in there, we learn what the limit actually is. We learn where the actual show has to stop. And so for us, whether we're looking at FCC complaints, whether we're looking at tweets, we're learning what the limit is. When the NFL says, J-Lo, you can't have those cages out on that stadium. That's too political. We're learning the limits of like, yes, we want to celebrate this. Yes, you can do the US Puerto Rican flag flip. That's cute. But the limit is this. And so I'm always interested in how the NFL, Rock Nation, these corporate kind of sponsorship, this highly sponsored event, tells us what the limits are. So solidarity seems to be a limit. These very clear kind of pointed ways to speak to policy, to speak to the nation in this way seems to be a limit. And so the ways that the contestation of the nation state happen and where we're told to stop is where I'm so fascinated these days.
Yeah, Courtney answered that perfectly in terms of the limits of the appropriate. I'm going to take negotiation from a different angle, especially this question of like, as an American show. Because I think there's a couple things there that actually connect to some of the points we talked through earlier of like this movement of NFL into this global space, which is fascinating to me too when we think about the National Football League, because football means something very different to every culture outside of the United States, right? Every country. And so there's this like discursive power move that's happening too of like, even if we become integrated into sports markets outside of the United States, right? Of like, how are we going to frame football as a sport? Football, right? Is it just American football that we're attaching sort of nation state identity to the sport to make this distinction? But I think that, it's an interesting thing that's happening there, but also this notion of it being an American show. American in the sense that it's been rooted in American ideology. It's been used repeatedly to uphold notions of the nation state. And we can point to many, many different examples there, maybe one of which I'll conclude with. But it's also a stage that has been engaged with, inhabited by performers outside of the United States, right? So this notion around Bad Bunny and his whether or not he belongs, whether or not he's American or un-American, right, is both either complete erasure or reframing of what it means to be an American citizen and the complicated histories of Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States as a territory. Bad Bunny is a U.S. citizen. But also, I mean, we think in terms of this notion and representation of the nation, we also often think about U2's performance, which was the first halftime show following the September 11th attacks, and what it meant to have a band from outside the United States, right, an Irish band that had been pre-selected prior to this major event. And then how do they become then part of that narrative? And you see Bono revealing the American flag inside his bomber jacket. You have a scroll with names of folks who perished in those attacks. But, Coldplay, Rihanna, right? This is a stage that has already in some ways been global. And this is something that we see as a broader trend too, of when the NFL was in Sao Paulo in September, they had Colombian artist Karol G, also a global icon, performing at the halftime show. Or I think also in September, Snoop Dogg was in Melbourne at the AFL championship halftime. So there's also this sort of culture industry formula that has happened with halftime shows conceptually, that I think we can credit the NFL to some extent with sort of inculcating in cultural expectations, but that's moved beyond sports. But that's also about artists moving all around, multiple directions. So I say that to sort of complicate this notion of an American show, although it has been a stage on which America is constantly the topic of conversation, whether or not it is more overtly presented, like Kendrick Lamar, to engage it, or, I mean, we also think a lot about Lady Gaga's 2017 performance. Ann Powers, incredible music critic, now for NPR, formerly with the LA Times and other places, wrote this great piece following Lady Gaga's performance in 2017, where she asked the question, like, should we expect pop stars to lead the resistance, right? If this is a battleground, should we expect them to lead the resistance? And she was thinking in part about Lady Gaga's show, because prior to Lady Gaga performing, there was a ton of anticipation, not dissimilar from this moment, about she moves in solidarity. She is very vocal with her alignment and allyship with particular causes. And how is she going to use this stage? And it's the first Super Bowl halftime show a few weeks after President Trump has been inaugurated for his first term. And she opens that performance with a medley that goes from America the Beautiful to This Land Is Your Land to the Pledge of Allegiance, right? And so it was sort of this like, oh, is there space for subversion? We would argue yes. Cultural scholars, Fifth Stewart Hall, ingrained in us, would argue yes, but it's done in a different way that is perhaps more subversive than overt. And so I think that negotiation is always, the potentials for that negotiation are always there. The question is, if it doesn't land with a lay audience, are there potentialities for progress, right? Because we as scholars, we can sit and dissect all of these things and pull in this context. But if there's not movement happening for viewers, or not movement that is significant for viewers, then is it actually effective? Which, is perhaps a separate conversation. But I think the potentialities for negotiation are always there. How effective they are is maybe a different kind of question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's been interesting to, there was an old adage that said, Americans learn geography when we go to war. And it seems like this is another case where we're learning about sort of who is a citizen by having someone from Puerto Rico be the be the Super Bowl performer. So you're just mentioning some of these other past controversies, and in your analysis of the 2020 halftime show, which featured Jennifer Lopez, Shakira, and Bad Bunny, you noted that there was another potential controversy, and I think you kind of just mentioned it with the showing children in cages to protest the first Trump administration's child separation policy. But then you noted that sort of, and a key part of your methodology is looking at FCC complaints, and you noted that in those complaints, most of the complaints were about Jennifer Lopez and Shakira's bodies and how they moved and dressed on stage, particularly as mothers. So Perry, in one of your framings, you said that this was a way of America telling on itself. And so I wanted you to maybe say a little more about that in the 2020 show. You also both talk about this in relation to Kendrick Lamar's, the FCC comments around Kendrick Lamar last year. And maybe, do you see the same thing happening with the Bad Bunny controversy today? Are we hearing some people say the quiet part out loud again?
Yes, we are. And I'll pop it to Courtney too to elaborate on this more. But what I will say is, FCC complaints publicly available. I encourage anybody who's never spent time with them to do so for any show. They're fascinating just in terms of what they reveal. And they're anonymized in terms of you don't know an individual's identity, but they do geolocate. So you have a sense of where individuals are submitting from, which also to this question of mapping gives you an interesting ideological map of where certain sentiments are perhaps more vocalized, maybe not necessarily representative, but more vocalized across the United States. But exactly to your point, and to elaborate on what Courtney had suggested earlier, there was J.Lo in her dual halftime show with Shakira did incorporate these sort of metaphorical cages, and they were in direct conversation with the child separation that was happening at the border and the way that immigrants were being policed, villainized, which we continue to sort of see the ramifications and descendants of that in practice today. And the night before the Super Bowl, it was suggested, and J.Lo gets into this in her documentary Halftime, that from the highest authority, which we presume is Roger Goodell, saying you need to pull the cages. And she opts not to. But what the NFL was afraid of in that moment, that this is too political or you will be antagonizing viewers, didn't end up being the thing that they were antagonized by. It was the fact that J.Lo and Shakira were perhaps more scantily clad than some audience members felt was appropriate. The fact that they were scantily clad as women over 40, the fact that they were scantily clad as women over 40 who were mothers. It's like this sort of breakdown that happened of like on the basis of not just gender, but age, thinking about maternity, and then thinking about the pole that Jennifer Lopez dances on, which athletically is its own feat of prowess, but also for thinking, to take a step back from the halftime show, this is coming off of Jennifer Lopez's performance in Hustlers, which she was award nominated for, right? So it's in conversation with things that are happening off stage as much as it is on stage. But the FCC complaints really, really revealed that the biggest issue, the biggest threat, was that there were bodies on stage who were being presented in ways that were not conforming to traditional notions of femininity. And so the telling on ourselves in part is situating us, how far removed are we or how close are we to these dominant ideas around gender, around sexuality, around norms of these limits of the appropriate. And the backlash, it always gives us these moments of punctuation. But it wasn't the cages, right? In fact, it was the idea of women as mothers being too revealing rather than engaging at all with this notion of how should we protect children. And there were children in those cages on the stage, including J.Lo's own daughter, right, who were part of this performance. So the idea of which children should be protected really came through in the FCC, because it was the viewing children, for the children. This was not family friendly. We need to protect our children, which is laden with all kinds of, sentiments rooted in notions of traditional nuclear family, white, middle class, Puritan framing. But I'll pop it to Courtney. I know you've got more here.
I think the idea of the family and family friendly, when we talk about the NFL, I mean, this is me fully sports studies lens on, is just, it's just a fallacy given what we know about the history of the NFL, its inability to protect its own players. It's in this idea of faith, family football as this mantra. So much of it is just about sustaining some kind of discourse that could never exist. It's such a violent game, just at its core. And so one of the things that I think is the idea of how this concert is framed within what is happening on the field. The idea, the limits of the appropriate. We're not talking about cheerleaders who are also subject to terrible labor conditions as well, about who can be scantily clad, who can perform in what kinds of ways. We think about the commercials that are attached to these programs. I mean, we're mostly selling beer and gambling at this point, commercials for sports. And so this idea of the family being protected, the fact that J.Lo and Shakira are seen as the pillars that are going to destroy the family, not CTE, and not any of the harms that are happening. Like it's really fascinating to me. And so one of the things I think about when we're reading these FCC complaints about the family, or even the misreadings that we start to understand of people not even being able to conceive of what's happening on the stage. So I'm interested in how people decode the performances, where I'm like, those aren't even the words to that song. I think it's really interesting. So this idea of, and especially when we think about gender, how women are always, I guess, at the limit of the appropriate from the time they step onto the stage. No matter what they say or do or having that political voice, it's about what you are wearing. And so part of it, it's about the gyration. It's what you're doing. So even when we have someone like Rihanna perform, Rihanna is pregnant, she's fully covered, and people are still complaining about her body. They have missed all of the production of the show. They've missed all the things, even the things I thought people would be mad about. She's performing Bitch Better Have My Money. She's doing Pour It Up. She's doing all the hits that I was like, she's not going to do those songs. They're like, she was gyrating. And so part of it is like, there's something really interesting about what she's doing, about the ways that she's even doing parts of her songs that have these problematic men involved. And she's like, no, I'm going to take my parts back. There's all these interesting things we could talk about in terms of Rihanna, but it's like either about she's pregnant, or it's like, she shouldn't be doing this, right? How dare a pregnant woman? So it's always returning to sexuality maternity, the body in a way where there's no way to do any other reading. And it's interesting because when men perform, we're able to see a little bit more because there's not that hyper focus in the same way. So I think about even the Dr. Dre and Friends, one of my favorite recent performances actually, that goes back to Super Bowl 56, which is a big deal because this is the first kind of hip hop headlining act versus just kind of like a round table of genres that we've seen before. And so, I mean, from a production standpoint, it's a staggering, beautiful performance, all these set pieces. And people are like, what is this DEI show? There are no white performers. Eminem is literally one of the performers. But one of the complaints are like, what is up with these diversity performances? What is up with this hip hop stuff? When hip hop is the most popular genre of music, right? And so I think about what it means when people are are looking for something. I think people that I've never filed an FCC complaint, so I can't speak to that kind of need. But I always find it interesting when people say, where are the white performers? There should be at least one. It's like, well, there was one. Did you? But the thing that the NFL was worried about was about Eminem taking a knee. This was the big kind of thing, or the idea of any like anti-police language that is baked into Dr. Dre and NWA's entire politic, right? So wanting to both police the lyrics and tell Eminem he can't take a knee, all of these things, the NFL is always thinking about where the controversy might be. What I think is hilarious is that it's always somewhere different.
Where they don't expect it.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that I can't even start to say. I can think about what I would want Bad Bunny to do or what I thought would be really provocative on this stage. But whatever it is that we might think might pull something from folks, it's always something completely different. It's not the cages. It's mothers wearing clothes or not enough clothes, right? So it's always something different than what we expect. I think that's so interesting.
That definitely is.
I just want to elaborate briefly. It's like, because I think the through line that we do see, right, is that the thing that is at risk always is the preservation of the white nuclear family, right? That's the thing that's always under threat. And that then embodies this notion of Americanness. So whether it's mothers, right, or being over-sexualized, it's like this is being projected onto women of color in a particular way that also pulls forward these tired stereotypes and tropes about over-sexualized bodies, right? Or the aggressive Black male. And so it's like that is getting mixed up into this really toxic stew that then represents it. But the thing that's under threat, right? The faith family football, right? If we think about the All-American halftime show, this antidote that Turning Point USA is putting on, or presumably, as a contrast to the Super Bowl halftime show, right? It's faith, family, freedom, right? But whose freedom, right? And which families? And so that's the like saying the quiet part out loud is by putting this as a direct contrast, you're saying that the freedom of the individual that is being represented or the communities that are being represented on stage are not the ones that matter, which is why Christy Noem's saying we're going to have ICE at the Super Bowl, right? That's not about freedom. That is the antithesis, right? It's the opposite of freedom. So the through line is that it is rooted in a culture of fear, and that culture of fear is that this notion of the white nuclear family is at risk by virtue of these entertainment selections.
Well, so since you mentioned the turning point, I was sort of curious about. One of the things that you mentioned in some of your panels, Courtney, is that the ratings information shows that many people tune in for the Super Bowl just to watch the halftime and then don't go back to watch the second half of the game. So I'm curious, like just logistically, can you imagine a successful alternative halftime that's not featured on a major television network? This seems a very fraught, almost logistically impossible situation.
I mean, I feel like it's hard to say in this way that we consume sport and television in general in this new streaming world. We kind of do hop around in different kinds of ways. I don't expect those ratings to be great because, again, this idea Perry mentioned about hate watching, like some people are going to do it because they need something for their FCC complaint. And we will be seated to read those bad boys on Monday. That will be our Monday. Please believe that. So one of the things that I think is important is like what people say. So much of this feels like about this idea of creating like this like two Americas. Like we have to create our own. We are being forced out. There's a sense of loss. But the other thing that I think is really interesting about sport, why I think it's so fun to watch, is that you don't get these, there are alternate telecasts, right? You can watch, with the Manning brothers, for example, on these alternative telecasts, but you're still watching on ESPN, right? So when we watch things like the Super Bowl, we watch the World Series, we watch the Olympics, these are rights that are given to a singular network, and you watch them there. You're going to watch the Fox you can't watch an MSNBC version of the sports, right? And so one of the things I think is so interesting about belonging and a sense of community that sport gives us that's really interesting is that we all watch the thing. And it's the thing on Monday at the proverbial water cooler, you're going to say, did you watch Bad Bunny? Did you see what Benito did? Part of it is that the FOMO of it, this is not even from a business, not even from a media study. This is general human FOMO energy. People are going to want to know. They may not admit that they watched, but I think when we see the ratings, people are going to tune in because they've heard. There are people that do not watch football at all, to your point, that are going to be like, everyone seems mad about this thing, I got to watch it, right? Everyone seems upset. So some people just love watching the chaos. And then some people are going to just watch the football. Some people watch for commercials. People tune into the Super Bowl mostly so they can feel like they are tuned into a pop cultural moment at this point, more than it is about the football. We have had some fantastic games more recently, but there are a lot of duds when it comes to the Super Bowl. The team that seemed better won, and we knew in the first half they were winning, right? And so one of the things I think is so interesting is that the FOMO of it all, not about these various forms. I think there's going to be a lot of money spent for a kind of mid performance somewhere else, right? Because who is going to sign on to this show, I think is part of it. And then thinking about who's producing it. The best producers in the world put this show together. You have the best of everything. These people are work on the Oscars. These people work on the Grammys. You have the best production folks. You have the best costumers, best makeup. Who's gonna be working on this show, right? Not to say that people won't do it for a check. We see that with every iteration of this. But I'm fascinated. What is going to compel this show for people to watch? I'm not going to have FOMO about this alternative performance. I want to see what Bad Bunny's going to pull out. And so to the point, it might be the Gaga hype of will it be so political, or will it be kind of you have to read the tea leaves to know what's going on? That's a conversation I'm interested in. And again, there are things that could be very political. His music is very political. He could do all types of really interesting visuals with that. But I think the idea of turning away from it, there's too much allure, whether you're going to hate watch it or watch it because, like me, you love Bad Bunny. I think it's really, really interesting. We're going to have to see, but I would love to see those numbers after the fact. I don't think they will be great.
No. Well, so I want to close with one really important question. You said you both have talked about consumption being key to the Super Bowl, whether you're consuming media or food on your couch. And Courtney, you mentioned that you might be eating queso and melting into the couch. And this sort of reminded me of a segment that Desi Lydic did on the Daily Show, where she was showing these clips of right-wing critics of Bad Bunny, one of whom said she'd just skip watching it altogether and would instead go and take that time to make some guacamole. And so these kind of comments first kind of make me wonder where we'd be without the Latino culture they seem to be oblivious to. But I'm also just curious, what are you eating during the Super Bowl? What's your go-to?
Oh, I think it's so interesting. I say queso. I'm from Texas. And so for me, when I think about broader Latinx culture, so much of my own relationship to the world would be so different without it. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is the way that we have seen for a long time, a lot of the most right-wing conservative folks are also the folks that are interracial dating, that love international cuisines. That is not lost on me, right? The idea, there was one point during one of the Trump campaigns where it was we're going to take all these food, we're going to get all these taco trucks off the street. And people were like, wait. we cannot lose the taco trucks, right? So this idea of that's the move too far. And so I think the idea of consumption, whether it's consuming other cultures, through food, through sport, through music, that has always been out of that playbook where you want the culture, but not the people. We can say that about a lot of different kinds of ways that folks that otherwise that don't want to see, any form of diversity, that don't want to see these kind of cultural exchanges happen, seem to love to do that in their free time themselves, right? They don't want it for everyone else, but they want to be able to dabble, whether it's in terms of their own personal relationships and their own personal kind of consumption. And so we see that in this longer kind of lineage. It's not surprising that there's always this telling on yourself, these very ironic comments that happen where we can all kind of giggle and have that levity. I think about the long-term impact of that, of what it means to want these things, or even for Bad Bunny in these longer kind of conversations of people that want to go to Puerto Rico, or he makes these longer lineages. One of my favorite Bad Bunny songs, Connections to Hawaii. What happened to Hawaii? This song is incredible, of like thinking about the ways that people want these destinations, these places, the beach, all these things. He says, you want to take my river and my beach too, right? You want my neighborhood, my kids to leave, right? So the idea of wanting these places, these food cultures, but not the people that are attached to them, I think is exactly what Bad Bunny is going to give us, is pointing out these kinds of contradictions, because he's done that so well in his music and his performances around the world.
Thanks. I don't know, Perry, if you want to share your favorite.
Share my dish. Generally, I am asked to make some lemon bars. I am quite well known for my lemon bars, so that's usually what I bring to the party. But food is a huge part of it, right? One layer. The snacks are important. The last thing I would just say, exactly to Courtney's point, there's a great piece called 1955 by Alice Walker. That's essentially a sort of fictionalized reimagination of the story of Hound Dog, which Elvis is best known for, but actually is, the song that was written for a Black woman, Big Mama Thornton. And in that piece, Walker says essentially, like, they want what you got, but they don't want you. And it's this sort of extractive practice that the United States is quite familiar with, of sort of taking from cultures, practices, rituals, foods, musical movements, and repackaging them to the benefit of whiteness historically, right? And so that practice of extraction, I mean, it's comments like that of like, I'm not going to watch, I'm going to go make some guacamole, like that is, without the like awareness. It's just so telling, and it's worth a giggle. And then it's like, okay, we got all the work to do.
Well, thank you both for sharing your work. I'm going to bring up on the screen your the project that you're working on, which is the let's see here, Sound of Victory. This is the Sound of Victory website, so please go and check this out. Thanks for joining us. This has been a really spectacular conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about your work and the topic. And maybe you can come back and unpack the actual show, the FCC comments, and update us on the edited collection later on. So thanks a lot. So next Wednesday, October 29th at 11 a.m. Chicago time, we'll be discussing the 2026 Cultural Studies Association call for papers with a few of the program committee members. We'll start the show doing that. And then we'll talk to Pablo Castagno, who's one of our colleagues, about the Argentinian presidential election results and whether Trump's infusion of $40 billion in promises to buy Argentinian beef were enough to keep the chainsaw-wielding right-wing leader Javier Milei in office. So if you registered for the Zoom, the same link should work. And if you're joining us on YouTube, it'll be streaming here again. This episode will also be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel. Please share it with your colleagues and let us know if you have any ideas about future episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com.
And thanks again for joining us. I'm Rob Carley.
And again, I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com.